Welcome to Audit the Audit, where we sort out the who and what and the right and wrong of police interactions. This episode covers reasonable suspicion, the Fifth Amendment, and assault, and is brought to us by the Oklahoma City Police Department's channel. Be sure to check out the description below and give them the credit that they deserve. Before we dive into the interaction, I want to give a big thanks to the sponsor of this episode, Vessi. If you're anything like me, then you probably own a pair of shoes for just about any occasion. In fact, it has been widely reported that the average American owns 19 different pairs of shoes. Wouldn't it be great if you could condense your shoe collection into one super comfortable wear-anywhere pair of shoes? Not only are Vessi stylish, cozy, and designed to go with almost any outfit, but they are also totally waterproof and extremely durable. Vessis are made with a Dymatex material, which is a dual climate knit that keeps your feet cool in the summer and warm in the winter. The material feels very cloth-like and breathable to the touch, similar to a running shoe, but also repels water and snow, much like a high-end hiking boot. I recently went on a hike at my local trails, and the Vessis kept my feet cool and dry throughout the entire trip. Never has there been a shoe that looks this good with this much durability and functionality, and all Vessi shoes are sustainably made with less water waste and no animal byproducts. Especially now that summer is here, Vessis are my go-to shoes by my door. Check them out in the link below and use code AUDIT to get $25 off of your Vessi shoes. Thanks again to Vessi for sponsoring this episode. On April 29, 2021, the Oklahoma City Police received a 911 call from an individual claiming to be Duncan Johnson about an African-American male hiding in the bushes outside of the Carver Transitional Center, which is a halfway house in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. Sergeant Miller from the Oklahoma City Police Department responded to the call and approached First Amendment Auditor Floyd Wallace Jr. on the street a few blocks away from the Carver Center.
We were just wanting to know why you're hanging out over the Carver Center, just hiding behind the bushes. Can you show me your hand, man? I got a taser right here. Okay. Show me your hand. Show me your hand, buddy. You got ID on you?
Go away.
Go away? Why are you bugging the folks over there?
Go away.
Huh?
Go away.
Well, I'm trying to figure out what's going on, man. You got your info on you? You got an ID?
Go away.
I don't have to go away. I'm here to investigate an incident, dude.
The sergeant asks Mr. Wallace to provide identification several times, and Mr. Wallace responds by repeatedly telling the officer to go away. Based on the totality of the circumstances, including the information provided in the 911 call and the officer's observations of Mr. Wallace's somewhat bizarre behavior, the officer likely had reasonable suspicion to detain Mr. Wallace to investigate the situation. Mr. Wallace matched the description provided in the 911 call, and although crouching behind bushes outside a halfway house is not a crime, it is certainly suspicious behavior that could lead the officer to believe criminal activity, such as hiding contraband for a resident of the Carver Center to pick up, was potentially occurring. Additionally, Mr. Wallace's proximity to the correctional facility could be another factor contributing to the officer's legal authority to detain and investigate him. As the Supreme Court explained in the 2000 case of Illinois versus Wardlow, quote, "An individual's presence in an area of expected criminal activity, standing alone, is not enough to support a reasonable, particularized suspicion that the person is committing a crime. But officers are not required to ignore the relevant characteristics of a location in determining whether the circumstances are sufficiently suspicious to warrant further investigation." The court also determined in the Wardlow case that, quote, "In reviewing the propriety of an officer's conduct, we cannot reasonably demand scientific certainty from judges or law enforcement officers where none exists. Thus, the determination of reasonable suspicion must be based on common sense judgments and inferences about human behavior. In allowing such detentions, Terry accepts the risk that officers may stop innocent people. If the officer does not learn facts rising to the level of probable cause, the individual must be allowed to go on his way." Given these considerations, it is likely a court would find that Sergeant Miller had reasonable suspicion to detain Mr. Wallace while investigating the allegations in the 911 call. However, even if the sergeant didn't have reasonable suspicion, it's important to bear in mind that he would be within his authority to stand on the sidewalk and observe Mr. Wallace, or attempt to engage him in a consensual encounter nonetheless.
Are you all right?
Go away, dude.
I'm here to see why you're hiding behind the bushes.
I didn't get you. I didn't tell you.
Huh?
I just told you too many times to go away. Too many times, dude. Go away.
Keep your hands out of your pockets, bud.
I told you too many times to go away, dude.
Keep your hands out of your pockets.
Sometimes you just gotta go away.
Get your hand in your pocket, man.
My hands are
Your hands are cold.
cold.
The 72-degree weather.
Okay, no, I've got a medical condition.
Do you need an ambulance?
I need to go home.
You need me to go away? Well, I'm here to help you out, man. Figure out what's going on.
How about go away? How about going home?
Like I said, I'm just here to figure out. The sooner you tell me what's going on, the sooner I can get out of your hair. You understand that?
Sergeant Miller asks Mr. Wallace a series of questions, and Mr. Wallace remains silent. In the 2013 case of Salinas versus Texas, the Supreme Court concluded that an individual who simply refused to answer questions by saying nothing had not invoked his right to remain silent because, quote, a suspect who stands mute has not done enough to put police on notice that he is relying on his Fifth Amendment privilege. The court also stated that, quote, the Fifth Amendment does not establish an unqualified right to remain silent, and allowed the suspect's silence when asked whether a ballistics test would show that the shell casings found at the crime scene would match his shotgun to be used as evidence that he was guilty because he did not explicitly invoke his right to remain silent. Throughout his interaction with the officer, Mr. Wallace also engaged in passive-aggressive body language and gestures and blatantly attempted to appear threatening. In the 1972 case of Adams versus Williams, the Supreme Court explained that, quote, the policeman making a reasonable investigatory stop should not be denied the opportunity to protect himself from attack by a hostile suspect. When an officer is justified in believing that the individual whose suspicious behavior he is investigating at close range is armed and presently dangerous to the officer or to others, he may conduct a limited protective search for concealed weapons. So long as the officer is entitled to make a forcible stop and has reason to believe that the suspect is armed and dangerous, he may conduct a weapon search limited in scope to this protective purpose. Applying this legal standard, the court would likely conclude that Mr. Wallace's behavior would allow Sergeant Miller to conduct a protective frisk for his own safety.
Can you take your hand out of your pocket? No? Okay. You got any mental health issues that we should know? I don't understand why you're trying to like be so sneaky by putting your hands in your pockets, trying to make me on edge, brother. I don't understand.
I told you to go away.
Well, I don't have to go away. I'm here to investigate something.
You guys to go away multiple times?
You have your ID
Walk
with you?
up behind me.
You have your ID with you?
Don't walk up behind me.
Hey, you got your ID with you? Why are you
Nope.
hanging out over here?
Don't walk up behind me. I done told you guys to go away. Stay in my range.
We just need your ID, brother, to figure out who you are.
Stay in my range.
Hey, do we have any charges?
No, he was just hanging over there, hiding behind the buildings.
So he just needs to leave the property.
Right,
Okay.
He's on a
So we got to call
property.
him. We got a trespassing complaint.
right.
So where are you going?
He doesn't want to answer any questions. Stop reaching behind you, bro.
Do you have any weapons?
Why do you keep reaching behind you, grabbing for stuff, man?
Back itches.
Back itches? Yeah, it looks bad when you do that. You know that, right?
It doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter.
No,
Okay.
my back actually does itch, bro.
Okay. Well, just so you know, I've said it on video. You're being recorded also. So don't go back over to that property. Are you
What's
cool
your
with
name and
that?
badge number?
Have a nice day, sir.
What's your name and badge
Just
number?
walk away.
What's your name and badge number?
Miller 1582.
What are you doing? What are you doing? What's that for? What's that for? What's that for?
Don't
What are you
touch
doing?
me. Don't
What are you
touch
doing?
me, bro.
What are you
Don't
doing?
touch me.
Bye bye. Go away.
I'm asking for your name and badge number.
We don't have to give that. Bye bye. Don't. What are you
What's your
doing?
name and badge number, dude?
Back off.
Go in your car.
Back off.
I'm escorting you.
Sergeant Forbes shoves Mr. Wallace to the ground, places him into handcuffs, and proceeds to accuse Mr. Wallace of attempting to assault him. Section 21-641 of the Oklahoma statutes defines assault as, quote, any willful and unlawful attempt or offer with force or violence to do a corporal hurt to another. In the 2016 case of United States versus Mitchell, the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals explained that Oklahoma law allows individuals to be convicted of assault when they threaten imminent battery with an overt action that is more than mere words. Given this definition, a court could conclude that Mr. Wallace's conduct in walking towards the officer and raising his hand constituted an assault, and the officer clearly interpreted his behavior as the precursor to an attack, even if that was not Mr. Wallace's intent. In the 2010 case of Morales versus City of Oklahoma, the Oklahoma Supreme Court described the Oklahoma City Police Department's use of force policies, which are set out in its operations manual, stating that, quote, the manual instructs officers to use only such force as is reasonable and necessary under the circumstances, circumstances, including such force as is reasonably necessary to effect a lawful arrest and prevent the escape of a person lawfully arrested. The manual defines reasonably necessary force as force used when all other reasonable means to accomplish the desired action have been exhausted or would clearly be ineffective under the circumstances. Additionally, as the U.S. Supreme Court held in the 1989 case of Graham versus Connor, quote, all claims that law enforcement officers have used excessive force, deadly or not, in the course of an arrest, investigatory stop, or other seizure of a free citizen should be analyzed under the Fourth Amendment and its reasonableness standard. The reasonableness of a particular use of force must be judged from the perspective of a reasonable officer on the scene, rather than with the 20/20 vision of hindsight. Not every push or shove, even if it may later seem unnecessary in the peace of a judge's chambers, violates the Fourth Amendment. The court went on to note that police officers are often forced to make split-second judgments in rapidly evolving circumstances about the amount of force that is necessary in a particular situation. While it is less likely that Mr. Wallace could be convicted of assault for his actions, a court would probably find that Officer Forbes' use of force did not violate the Fourth Amendment, given the lenient standard of reasonableness that courts must apply and the officer's interpretation of Mr. Wallace's conduct. However, the sergeant's use of force did seem to unnecessarily escalate the situation and could be found to have violated the department's use of force policies, as there were likely other reasonable means available to accomplish the desired action.
What's going on?
I asked you for another badge number. I didn't cut you.
No, you pulled your fist up at me.
No, I didn't.
You approached me. You were going to attack.
No, I wasn't. I was actually.
Okay, now you're under investigative detention.
The officers placed Mr. Wallace under arrest and transported him to the Oklahoma County Detention Center, where he was held until 1 a.m. the next day. Mr. Wallace was charged with 1 count of interfering or obstructing by disobeying a lawful command. On May 5th, 2021, additional charges were filed against Mr. Wallace, as well as local auditors Timothy Harper and Patrick Roth. The new charges included 1 count of falsely reporting a crime and 1 count of conspiracy. In an affidavit filed along with the charging document, Detective Thomas Van Nort of the Oklahoma City PD alleged that Mr. Wallace conspired with Mr. Harp and Mr. Roth to make a false 911 call and then recorded the scene with their cell phones to post on social media. Detective Van Nort claims that Mr. Harper made the 911 call from Mr. Roth's phone knowing that there was no criminal activity in order to create a police interaction to audit. As of the writing of this episode, the charges are still pending. Overall, Sergeant Miller gets an A+ for remaining within the bounds of his authority throughout the interaction, maintaining a calm and collected demeanor, and for making a legitimate effort to investigate Mr. Wallace's conduct as peacefully as possible. Mr. Wallace offered Sergeant Miller several opportunities to overreact to his gestures, and the sergeant would have been within his authority to handcuff Mr. Wallace at any time. Instead, the sergeant made several attempts to engage with Mr. Wallace and actively worked to de-escalate the situation. Sergeant Miller didn't see the actual altercation that took place between Mr. Wallace and Sergeant Forbes, and based on Mr. Wallace's conduct up until that point, it would be reasonable for Sergeant Miller to assume that Mr. Wallace had legitimately committed a crime and was being lawfully arrested. As mentioned earlier, if Mr. Wallace had approached Sergeant Forbes in a blatantly threatening manner, then he would be subject to detainment and arrest. And because Sergeant Miller had his back turned when the altercation took place, he likely assumed that Mr. Wallace had done something to constitute a violation. I commend Sergeant Miller for handling this encounter with patience and professionalism. Sergeant Forbes gets an F for maintaining a hostile and confrontational attitude throughout the interaction, failing to employ any measure of de-escalation, and for escalating the encounter into a physical altercation and arrest. There is no doubt that Mr. Wallace's conduct largely contributed to the escalation of this encounter, but Sergeant Forbes' intervention into the dialogue between Mr. Wallace and Sergeant Miller also negatively impacted this interaction's outcome. The doctrine of reasonableness often blurs the line between subject and objective interpretation in regards to police interactions, and where some encounters offer clearly definable tenets to build legal precedents upon, others are not so easily translated into a neat set of rules that can be universally referred to. The courts are often tasked with balancing the subjective perceptions of the parties involved with the known objective facts of the encounter, and rendering an opinion that considers uncontrollably subjective factors such as perceived intent and threat assessment. Courts offer considerable leniency to police officers and their trained perception, and as mentioned before, it is entirely possible that a court would consider the sergeant's conduct reasonable. All that said, it did not appear that Mr. Wallace presented a physical danger to the sergeant in the moment that he decided to shove Mr. Wallace to the ground. But whether or not the sergeant's threat assessment of Mr. Wallace was accurate is another subject entirely, and I'll leave that for you all to discuss in the comments below. Mr. Wallace also gets an F for using suggestible body language in an attempt to intimidate and provoke the officers, demonstrating a fundamental misunderstanding of reasonable suspicion, and for engaging the officers with an antagonistic and hateful attitude. Every aspect of Mr. Wallace's conduct was designed to exacerbate the hostility of this encounter, and it is extremely difficult to categorize this type of conduct as First Amendment auditing. Whether you consider auditing a form of protest or a form of journalism, nothing Mr. Wallace did in this interaction served to further the cause of constitutional awareness or police accountability, and this encounter highlights the importance of wielding your rights effectively and responsibly. If Mr. Wallace had approached anyone in the manner that he approached Sergeant Forbes, he likely would have received the very same treatment. And although that does not necessarily excuse Sergeant Forbes' conduct, it does demonstrate that Mr. Wallace was not an innocent victim of police misconduct. The affidavit filed by Detective Van Nort notes that the 911 call was traced to a geolocation that placed the caller in the same parking lot that Mr. Harper and Mr. Roth were near when the officers arrived on the scene, and the phone number used to make the call was associated with Mr. Roth's phone. If the allegations of the affidavit are true, then it will be difficult to prove that this interaction was a legitimate exercise of rights and not a calculated conspiracy to generate content. Ultimately, the courts will have the final say, and it'll be interesting to see how they interpret this encounter and the allegations of Detective Van Nort's affidavit. Let us know if there is an interaction or legal topic you would like us to discuss in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to check out my second channel for more police interaction content.